Evening, everyone. Ajahn Rato had this idea to invite me for a Q&A session about Ajahn Chah, and this being Ajahn Chah's birthday. And I was happy to do that, and then he thought, well, it might be good to get people to write down questions, and rather than getting into a session and then everybody's sitting silently. So anyway, there's lots of questions, and we'll see how it goes. I haven't really looked at them. I figured I would just respond to each question as it sort of hits me or lands, and then try to give a perspective or my thoughts on a particular question. Also, then, if anybody has any further questions, then feel free to put your hand up or make yourself known if I'm not responding to your presence, so that it can be interactive as well. So the first question is, what distinguished Ajahn Chah from other meditation teachers? I think, he tended to not be very methodical, which is a distinction. Many teachers, especially at that time, that era in Thailand, there was many who were focused on particular techniques, methodologies, and he didn't really use a consistent method that was sort of like the Ajahn Chah method of meditation. He gave basic tools, basic instructions that were pretty, on a certain level, generic, really. But he really responded to people and trying to give people what would be useful for them. Because I think for Ajahn Chah, the sense of there being, a particular method or technique that was going to really help you become peaceful or succeed in meditation, it was not the method so much as how you applied it. And he would emphasize right view over and over and over again. Right view was so important in this sense of understanding, how things work, and then how to make techniques work for you. And of course, he was very familiar with various techniques, and he himself had experimented with various things. But by his temperament, his main focus of meditation was much mindfulness of breathing and Buddho. That was kind of foundation. Mindfulness of breathing, Buddho. But then contemplations of the body in terms of the 32 parts, that was emphasized. Contemplation of the body in terms of the elements, that would be, you'd use that. But, I think what distinguished Ajahn Chah from other meditation teachers was his emphasis on how you live the life, how you live your meditation, how you live your practice, and making the meditation practice your life and your lifestyle. And that to me, that really distinguished him from other teachers. And so then he put a lot of emphasis on especially for the monastics, on the monastic form, on the integration of mindfulness and investigation in what one's doing, and being able to use the monastic form and the simplicity of the monastic form to live the teaching, live the training. He was much more, I'd say, maybe a trainer of people as opposed to a teacher who would just sort of expound. So those are some reflections. Any further questions on that? Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder the way it is inspired the way you teach.
Well, yeah, I would hope so. I've been, he was my teacher, he was my model, he was what inspired me to commit to practice and to Dhamma. so that try to, in some small way, to emulate, not trying to copy or mimic, but just trying to, because I saw the value in that, and I benefited from that, so that to try to teach from that experience. Yes?
Was there, like, if people brought from other traditions like Tibetan or Zen, if they come with a kind of approach from that tradition, how did he react to that? Was it okay in a way as long as it works, or?
Yes, and that's actually, and of course, Luang Pasanno is the very first one to talk about that, because he was, before he went to live with Ajahn Chah, he was living in a retreat center / monastery, and was in a Mahasi style monastery that taught that method, but he found didn't really work for him. And what did help him was the books he had read on teachings from Master Su Yun. There's a series of books, I can't remember how many, I think 2, maybe 3, of transcripts of a retreat that Master Su Yun gave when he was about 116. But very much emphasizing the Huatou method, which is basically questioning, who am I? And so then Ajahn Pasanno, when he went to live with Luang Por Chah, then he asked him about it and said, describe what he had been doing, and Ajahn Chah's only question was, is it helpful? Is it helping you? He said, yeah, I'll go for it. And he was always curious about, like there was a Zen monk who came to stay at Wat Pah Pong, a Japanese Korean Zen. And so that he had questions for him, and he was curious. He wasn't trying to push anything onto him. It was sort of, quit messing around with this stupid Zen stuff and do the real practice, the Theravada, and do Buddho. So he had I think, quite a broad perspective, and the bottom line for Ajahn Chah is basically the bottom line that the Buddha uses. When you do it like this, do wholesome dhammas increase and unwholesome dhammas decrease, or is it the opposite? And so that the importance is in that how to increase those qualities. Does it make you more peaceful, more clear, more discerning? Okay, second question. It is said that each monk who knew Ajahn Chah well would describe him in a different way when asked. How would you describe him? Yes, I mean, Ajahn Chah was, he was many people. And he could be fierce, he could be compassionate, he could be ebullient, he could be silent, he could be really quite refined, he could be a bit coarse sometimes. I think he responded to people. And I think that there's a difference. When you see somebody kind of trying to pose as something, then it really comes across as phony. And Ajahn Chah never came across as phony or facile or shallow or anything. It was always, there was some gravitas in whatever he was doing, whether he was kind of teasing you or he was kind of reaming you out. So that there was always a sense of so to describe him, I mean, there's a good reason why he gets described in different ways, is because he really was a multifaceted personality, as most personalities are, really, but his was not tempered in terms of trying to be anything in particular. I think he had the freedom to be what he felt was, and to me, one of the things that comes across in my image or picture of Ajahn Chah is supremely compassionate and ready to respond to people and situations. And again, as I say, he would be a different person for different people. I mean, he could be quite strict with some people. He'd be incredibly give space to different people, and so you never quite knew which Ajahn Chah you were going to get, which always kept you on your toes. And if you weren't on your toes, then it wouldn't take long before he'd call you on it. Any questions on that? Yeah.
What does it mean to be on your toes?
Alert. Be alert. Be present.
So when you like zone off, you when you like zone off, or you not doing.
Yeah, if you zone out, you're setting yourself up with Ajahn Chah. Next question is, what advice would you give to future abbots and teachers of Wat Pah Pong's branch monasteries so that the communities maintain the most important characteristics of Ajahn Chah's style of leadership? I think probably the main thing that I would encourage people is, because sometimes you try to pigeonhole it and get it into a catechism. If I just do this and this and this, everything's going to be all right. And I think what I would encourage is the advice is to be as, and I think this would be what Ajahn Chah would encourage, is just being, keeping a real fidelity to Dhamma Vinaya, the teachings and the training that are laid out in our lineage, in our traditions, in the scriptures, in the suttas, in the Vinaya, and making sure that you've got a source to keep referring back to, rather than making it up as you go along and trying to adapt to whatever's popular in whatever particular culture or era that one is in. That being said, Ajahn Chah was certainly a great example of somebody who took Dhamma Vinaya this is your teacher. This is what the Buddha gave us from the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, where Ananda is bemoaning the fact that the Buddha is going to pass away. He's going to parinibbana and not be a leader. And then the Buddha just said, I wasn't really the leader while you're here. It's this Dhamma and this Vinaya that is your leader, is your guide. So that they trying to return to those principles. And but Ajahn Chah would never do it in a pedantic kind of way, or even he was conservative, but he wasn't fundamentalist. So that he wanted to maintain a fidelity to the tradition and the lineage, but he was always willing to adapt and change. And so, like when Ajahn Chah was one of the first forest monasteries to adapt the chanting, changing the Pali chanting to translated chanting into Thai. Okay, that's new. That could be useful. People can understand what's being. So whereas in the tradition, and it's sort of like you don't want to sully the purity of you want to keep the Pali, and which has a certain validity to it. I can remember going to His Holiness the Dalai Lama's teachings one time in San Francisco, and we'd recently done and it'd been before, and normally before the teaching session begins, and His Holiness would invite each of the traditions to do a traditional chant, and he would always ask the Theravadins to chant first because we were the oldest, and chant the Mangala Sutta, and then ask the Mahayanas to chant the Heart Sutra. Then, of course, the Tibetans have their own particular blessing chant for beginning teachings, and so that's how you begin a teaching session. And so then chanting the Mangala Sutta had done that before, and then we had just recently done a translation. Actually, the translation that we chant now is still in an earlier form, hadn't been spiffed up. But I thought, well, that'd be a good idea. But see, I floated the idea past the organizers to check with His Holiness and see, because you don't just go up to the Dalai Lama and ask him, and said, would it be okay to chant the translated version into English so people can understand? And he said, and the word got back to you, he said, no, you really want to keep the original. You don't want to forget the original language. You want to keep that Pali. So in the, say like in translated chanting, the Pali and Thai are alternating all the time in Thailand. And so Ajahn Chah was one of the first monasteries to start doing that. He was one of the first forest monasteries to ban smoking and chewing betel nut in the monastery for the monks, which was a big deal then. There was quite a few monks left because it was just that's too extreme. And so nowadays you look back on this, how could they think like that? But in those days it was just really ordinary. And Ajahn Pasanno said that it was like the lunar observance nights. There'd be a meditation and chanting, and then there'd be pots of coffee, and then trays with cigarettes and betel nut. And the sal at Wapapong would just be filled with smoke. and Ajahn Chah that's so he's willing to change and adapt, but he could sort of see this is something that really fits with Dhamma Vinaya, even though the custom in Thailand and certainly in many of the forest monasteries in the Dhamma tradition, and that you wouldn't dare make the suggestion that they should curtailing their smoking and chewing betel nut. So Ajahn Chah. So in terms of Ajahn Chah's the characteristics and his style, I think being that fidelity to Dhamma Vinaya, but then also to really paying attention what's practical, what's useful, what's beneficial, and I think also in terms of style of leadership, one of the things he was, I think, quite unique in doing and being a leader is that he would always consult with the senior monks, consult with the lay people. He wouldn't it wouldn't be all of a sudden, well, I have seen an edict coming down, and but in general, it was a collaborative in the way that he included people in the decisions that he made. And for the most part, most people say, well, whatever you want, sort of thing, whatever you think is best. But he did, so that collaboration is, I think, a style that he was very good at. And I think, just in terms of the village, because both he, Luang Chah, as well as the vast majority of the monks were all from northeast of Thailand. So there is a kind of tradition. There's your leader, but then your leader has to be supported by the others. So there's always a process of sort of talking about decisions that are going to be made. Okay, next question. The word Toraman, torture, is sometimes associated with Luang Chah's style of training. Could he be, quote unquote, intentionally cruel? Toraman is kind of like, could be translated as torture, but it's more like hardship as well, going against the grain. So that Ajahn Chah was something that he was always willing to put obstructions in front of your desires, views and opinions and habits, which was incredibly compassionate as well as courageous, because that says it takes a certain courage to be willing to thwart other people's desires. And It's something that in the West is kind of hard to do. You've got to sit down and explain everything to people and get. Whereas Luang that would be part of his style of teaching. The actual routines in the monastery would oftentimes be designed to go against the grain, thwart the. But I think that was one of the qualities of Ajahn Chah. And of course, there were people who didn't like it, didn't want to be there, and left disaffected. But for those of us who spent a lot of time around him, the sense of being just intentionally cruel that thought wouldn't arise in the mind. It would be the predominant feeling is the trust in his kindness and compassion. To me, he always inspired a sense of trust, and that he was really trying to help us all the time. That was one of his, to me, a distinguishing characteristic as a human being, as a teacher, is just the tremendous compassion that he had. It's his willingness, because that willingness to be there for you, to help you, to guide you, to encourage you, but then also to thwart you so that you actually question, are my assumptions right and true? Are my views and opinions all right and true? Are my preferences really right and true? And because they all feel right, but when they're challenged is when you have to take a look at them. And that's a real kindness to do that for somebody, because it's the whole reason why we are constantly cycling through samsara and being reborn over and over again. It's a comfortable habit. It's not in our best interest at all, but we're used to it. So that having somebody really put a block on that way. Yeah, it could definitely be. And he could certainly be intentionally devious. I remember one time a monk, very restless, and he had ordained once, then he'd left, he's English, come back to England, kept that was stupid to leave. And then after a year or two, then he came back to Wat Pah Pong and asked to take on monastic training again. Ajahn Chah gave him a bad time, and for some time, yes, I'll take you on for monastic training again, but you're going to have to be an anagarika for 7 years. Normally it would only be a year or two, but you have 7 years. So you're giving him a bad time. But and of course then Ajahn Chah ordained him as a novice, ordained him as a monk, just following but he gave him a bad time. But the monk was very restless, and normally to go Tudong you have to have at least 5 rains, or go with another monk who does have 5 rains. And anyway, it was getting into hot season, and the monk was getting exceedingly restless, and came to Ajahn Chah and asked him if he could go on Tudong. And Ajahn Chah really knew his temperament, knew his personality very well, and said, "Oh, of course, yes, if you think you could go on Tudong. But it'd be good to take on certain practices. If you're going to go on Tudong, you should do it properly and take on practices so that you're using it to really learn from." And of course, at that point, the monk was ready to agree to anything, just to be able to get out of the monastery. And then Ajahn Chah said a couple things that he should be doing: no taking of rides, walking everywhere, no taking of rides, no staying in any place longer than 3 nights. And the monk was, again, he was just happy to agree to anything just to get out of the monastery. And so then he left on Tudong, and I don't think it was a month. It might have been 3 or 4 weeks. And I actually saw him come back into the monastery. And I greeted him. I said, "Oh, nice to see you back. How'd it go?" He said, "Oh, geez, it was tough. Ajahn Chah, he tricked me again. It was awful. It's hot season, and not being able to take any rides. I was just so hot walking along the roads, and then I couldn't stay anywhere for very long. I have to go out on. I'm so happy to be back." So he was. So yeah, I mean, he was intentionally thwarting him, but it was the person willingly agreed. He got set up. Okay. There are a few stories about Ajahn Chah and him having psychic powers, particularly reading minds. Did you ever observe anything of that sort with Ajahn Chah? What was Ajahn Chah's position on such things? Yes, I mean, I never really thought about it much. I mean, in the sense that my own temperament doesn't go to psychic powers. I have far too prosaic a mind to start thinking about psychic powers. But I never doubted that Ajahn Chah had that capacity, reading minds, as well as having a knowledge of, say, other realms, other beings. I mean, he had sort of like divine eye. And he would not, his own position on it would always to be downplay it. And his own sense, he said, you don't need to read somebody's mind. You just pay attention. You can see what their temperament is, what their inclinations are, what their habits of mind are. It displays itself. So he's a really good reader of people and of personality temperaments. So he could really see through people in that way. He certainly would not draw any attention to any occasions when it might have been read into it that he was. And then he would, so rare for him to talk about kind of different powers in different ways. And that, I mean, I've heard him talk about it in terms of, these are just natural outcomes of the, say, like of jhana, of samadhi practice. This is possibility of the mind. And it would just leave it at that. Or there was one time when I was sitting with him, and it was just myself and him, and then a layman came and asked him a question about a being who had said they'd come from Wat Pah Pong, like it was more like a ghost of some sort of other being, some kind of, and he was kind of, was that true? Was that right? And Ajahn Chah immediately identified that particular being. Said yes, sometimes he actually goes out of the monastery. And then he started talking about some of the other kind of beings that live in Wat Pah Pong, and one in particular had been obstructive to him when he first arrived, and then gained faith in him, and was still residing at Wat Pah Pong, hadn't taken rebirth anywhere else. And talking about these different beings in these different realms as they're there, and then the person had to leave. They had to go back to work, and that person was a regular supporter of Ajahn Chah, quite dedicated as a practitioner, very strong sila and interest in Dhamma, and then. Actually, he was like an engineer or driver for the state railroads. As soon as he retired, then he got permission from his family. He came and ordained and finished his life in the monastery. But anyway, so he left to go back to work. And then very shortly after that, then this group of Bangkok people came and paid respects, and they're kind of all excited to pay respects to Luang Por Chah, and immediately start talking. Oh, Luang Por, are there really such things as devas and ghosts and other realms of existence that beings inhabit? And Ajahn Chah looked at them. If I told you, would you believe me? And they said, oh, of course, Luang Por. I said, well, then you're really stupid. The Buddha said, don't believe in anybody else. You have to believe what comes from your own experience. End of story. He never said anything after that. Of course, they never asked anything after that either. So that was more his general position, but he how do you say, I think his knowledge and experience were much broader than his how he public. Because I think there's quite rightly a concern for people getting lost in the mystical, in the supernatural, and forgetting the actual teachings. And Ajahn Chah was somebody who always drew people back to the fundamental teachings, Sila, Samadhi, Panya, Sila, Samadhi, Panya. Just the fundamentals of the practice and the training. Next question, were there any particular themes Ajahn Chah's teachings that regularly came up? Sila, Samadhi, Panya. And he really didn't stray very far from those fundamentals of the training, and the Traisika, Sila, Samadhi, Panya. Really never strayed very far from Anicca, Dukkha, Anatta, and Four Noble Truths. I mean, those right view, Sila and right view, were really fundamental to how Ajahn Chah taught and laid the foundations, so that even over and above like a meditation practice, how is your Sila? How is your virtue? How is your integrity? What view are you holding? Or do you have view that aligns itself with Four Noble Truths? View that aligns itself with Anicca, Dukkha, Anatta? Those are just so important to Ajahn Chah, because without that fundamental foundation, that first step on the path starts already going off in some weird direction. And so that he was very good at planting people's feet right on the ground and starting the path. And so those themes would always come up, and certainly that aspect of not following habits, not following attachments, not following desires, relinquishment, letting go is the essence of the path. That being the knowing is just so important. That theme of learning how to distinguish between what is the mood of the mind, what's the object of the mind, and what is the knowing of that object, the knowing of that mood. Because the release is always in the knowing, it's not in the object. So those themes, he could expound on that forever. Many of Ajahn Chah's direct disciples have become revered teachers themselves. Would you say the harsher conditions and more rigorous practices of the early days of Wat Pah Pong played a necessary role in their training and development? Or was it mostly due to Ajahn Chah being such a masterful teacher? I think, again, Ajahn Chah would never lift himself up. And, of course, it's one of the reasons why he was so inspiring, I think. The conditions that in the early days of Wat Pah Pong were certainly helpful, but, it's just, sometimes it's, there's this nostalgia for the good old days. And that's to me, it's a fallacy or a fantasy. If I only had the good old days, had conditions like the good old days, then I'd really be free of suffering. But the reality is, we were all suffering then. It wasn't as if we were really diligent and really penetrating the Dhamma, just muddling along, trying to get by the same as everybody else is. And because the problem is not in the condition. I mean, if you complicate conditions too much, yeah, I mean, that can be an obstacle. But there was no, things were rigorous and simple because there was no choice to that. I mean, there was just the northeast of Thailand was very undeveloped, and I think what is important is that people internalize the teaching and the training, and those monks or those monastics who have internalized the training, they're able to speak with some authority and gain some kind of confidence with others. I mean, there's also the reality that say that, those, it's like the big trees in a forest, the big tree has to fall down for the small trees to grow up. And, with Ajahn Chah becoming ill and passing, that many of his other disciples started to display their abilities. But it's the reason why they are displaying, because they internalize the practice, and those who are waiting for some divine inspiration or just stubbornly holding to the form for some reason or another, it doesn't inspire people. So learning how to, and in the same way, in the time of the Buddha, the great disciples they had different temperaments and personalities, and different people would be drawn to them. So the same way, and say the disciples and students of Ajahn Chah, and then as it continues on into this, getting into, we're definitely moving into the next generation after the direct disciples of Ajahn Chah already, and different teachers are starting to manifest in different ways, and I think it's quite natural. But I think that to me, what is important is not so much the external conditions as the willingness to internalize the practice. And that's something for everybody to be reflecting on, whether it's people who are in positions of beginning to teach or have been teaching for a while, or been in positions of leadership, or within the lay community, and just how do we internalize this? Which goes all the way back to, say, the characteristics of the Dhamma. We chanted the open ahiko, leading inwards. And it's this Dhamma of the Buddhas has to be drawn into the heart. And it's important to keep doing that. Yeah, and Ajahn Chah was, I think, a masterful teacher for sure. And it's very rare that you get somebody who is, as kind of complete as Ajahn Chah. But you can't expect that of others. It is very rare. Even amongst the great disciples of Ajahn Mun, who Ajahn Chah is really a minor character in the disciples of Ajahn Mun. One, because he was Mahanikaya, so never lived with him for a very long period of time, and he didn't. And because of that, he was only a short time with Ajahn Mun. But it was a very important meeting that Ajahn Chah always carried with him. He dreamt of Ajahn Mun for years and years and years after. He's had this inspiration and faith. But Ajahn Chah, his ability to teach, and ability to inspire lay people, ability to inspire monastics, both monks and nuns. I mean, Wat Pah Pong community there was almost always almost an equal number of monks and nuns, and 50, 60, 70 monks, 50, 60, 70 nuns. For us as monks, we'd never see them, but they were there, and they were living and practicing. It was northeast of Thailand, but being able to inspire communities, and then to be able to lay a foundation that was carried on is really exceptional. It's really the norm that you have a teacher who inspires people and has a community of sorts, smaller or a little bit larger. But oftentimes once that teacher passes away, then people go in their different directions and the monastery is pretty much empty. But say Ajahn Chah has not been teaching since the early 1980s, and he died in 1992. That's 40 years of him not being directly involved. And Wat Pah Pong is still a thriving monastery and community. It's very exceptional. So yeah, there is something unique and masterful. A lot of it was him kind of encouraging and empowering others to rise up as well. Next question. Can you speak a little about the relationship Ajahn Chah had with Luang Por Thongrat and Luang Por Thongrat in general? We don't know much of that special teacher. No, we don't. There is a book in Thai and hasn't been translated into English yet. And it's a really fun book to read. Ajahn Thongrat was a very special teacher and different temperament, different personality, eccentric. And Ajahn Chah, when Ajahn Chah first went to visit him and pay respects, because they're in the northeast of Thailand, the vast majority of forest monks, practice monks, keeping the Vinaya, were all Dhammayut and in the lineage, and mostly in the lineage of Ajahn Mun or Ajahn Sao. But the teachers that Ajahn Chah drew close to were Mahanikai monks, Luang Pu Kinnerly, who Ajahn Chah had a much closer relationship with, and Luang Por Thongrat, who lived in Ubon, and it's hard to know exactly. I don't know exactly my own sense of it, and it could be completely fabricated on my part just from picking up bits and pieces. But Ajahn Chah used to go and visit and pay respects to Luang Por Thongrat from time to time. I don't know that he spent any extended period of time with him, but the very first time that he went to pay respects to Luang Por Thongrat, he heard his reputation because he had lived and trained with Ajahn Mun in the early days of Ajahn Mun's teaching career, Tudong, and before a lot of the formalization of him being kind of the flagship teacher of the Dhammayut tradition. And so there's a lot more fluidity between the Dhammayut and Mahanikai then. And so that Ajahn Thongrat lived and went Tudong with and stayed in the monasteries with Ajahn Mun. So then Ajahn Chah first went and paid respects. He was living down in Det Udom area, a bit south of Ubon, closer to the border of Cambodia. And he went in to pay respects, and Ajahn Thongrat, who'd never met him before, and Ajahn Chah, who'd never met Ajahn Thongrat before, and then Ajahn Thongrat, "Oh, Chah, ma leo." He said, "Oh, Chah, you've come." And he's like, "I've been waiting for you." So there was this immediate kind of familiarity. And Ajahn Thongrat, as eccentric as he was or could be, one of the unique features of his monastery was morning puja and meditation together, evening puja and meditation together, doing things as a group, and which is different than the Dhammayut Ajahn Mun style of get back to your kuti, practice on your own, stay in solitude, keep in solitude. And Ajahn Chah picked up that model to use as a model for Wat Pah Pong. So we inherited that from Ajahn Thongrat. And interesting because Ajahn Thongrat was such a strong character. I mean, he was criticized by he'd stand in front of lay people's houses and wait for them to, because in Thailand, if you walk on Pindabat in the villages, and you walk through, and then people come out all the time. They know it's happening. It's happening at a specific time. And there's a very polite way of saying, keep walking, I'm not offering anything. It's sort of, oh, the rice isn't cooked yet. Khao yang mai suk. And Ajahn Tonglat he'd been standing waiting there for some time, and the lay person calls out, oh yeah, the rice is cooked. It's okay, I'll wait. And he was asked after, he said, that's really impolite. And he said, yeah, but they have to learn how to offer. And he was willing to sort of train people or teach them or give them the opportunity to make offerings. And there I'm thinking of, there's a great story that Ajahn Mahabua tells of Ajahn Tonglat. Because Ajahn Tonglat had been with Ajahn Mun over the years and come and go. And then as Ajahn Mun got much older, then he was staying more in a monastery, he says. And Ajahn Mahabua was actually Ajahn Mun's attendant, and Ajahn Tonglat was. And Ajahn Mun was, getting older, so he wasn't teaching as much. So Ajahn Mun was upstairs in his kuti, and Ajahn Mahabua was down below, sort of keeping things clean and neat and tidy and being around, look after Ajahn Mun if he needed attention. And Ajahn Tonglat came in, and he started making loud noises, talking really loudly, banging things, and Ajahn Mahabua said, stop, Ajahn Mun, he's really good. And he said, stop me. And Ajahn Mahabua said, I was so scared my liver was shriveling. And he said, he's really getting fearful of Ajahn Mun giving him tongue lashing. And he said, and Ajahn, why? Stop. He says, we got to get him come down and teaching. And so that night there was a word got out, everybody come to the hall. And Ajahn Mun gave this blistering Dhamma talk, excoriating people for their lack of restraint and their lack of composure, and all the monks. And Ajahn Mahabua said, Tonglat's in there, smiling. It got him going. So Ajahn Tonglat, he wasn't that, I don't know how old he was when he passed away. He wasn't that old, I don't think. It could be late 60s, early 70s, something like that. And he, living in a monastery, a pretty simple place, a grassroots salad. There was a layman from Luang, the village, who was there. Ajahn Tonglat had told people, if anybody wants to come and hear some good Dhamma, then come such a night, and 3 days from now, 2 days from now, whatever. Anyway, so there, people are gathered, and he's sitting up teaching and talking with the lay people, and they had done puja and meditation. He's teaching, and then he's I'm getting pretty tired, and he laid down on his side and continued teaching. And then after teaching for a while, then he said, "Well, there's something to the effect, oh, I'm out of energy. I'll take my leave from you all now." And then he died. He was passed away there. So he's very revered, eccentric, but a seminal teacher for Ajahn Chah. And the monastery where he passed away, Lumpur Lia made the effort to protect it and expand the area around it to make sure it was protected. because it was starting to be encroached on. The original sala had sort of fallen down, and they had the cremation place. They knew where it was. Anyway, so they built Luang built a jetty and a sala, and it's a good functioning branch monastery at Wat Pah Pong now. What would Ajahn Chah say if he visited our Western monasteries today in 2025? Would he recommend any changes? One, I don't think he'd be shocked or surprised, or I think he'd be quite pleased. If he would say anything, it would be careful of getting too comfortable. Because we'd be saying the same thing in Thailand. I mean, it's just the reality of any monastery, and the longer it's established, the more faith is engendered, is stimulated, the more support it gets. There's been a pattern since the Buddha's taught, these cycles of, say, development and then dissipation, and most of them, there's some of the strongest language that the Buddha uses in the suttas, or his imagery for being cautious of gain, honor, and fame. It's a bitter thing. So that's just that sense of not getting lost in the comfort, not getting lost in the kind of faith that people have, but really again that fidelity to Dhamma Vinaya is just so important. It doesn't mean that you can't. You have to make yourself uncomfortable all the time, but it's just is you have to be very cautious of not to get lost. So, could you tell us your very first encounter with Luang Chah? How did it happen? What did he say to you? What impression did you have then? My very first encounter with Luang Chah, well, actually, not with him personally. My very first encounter with Luang Chah was I encountered a sheet of paper or a sheet or two of paper, and I was staying in a monastery in the outskirts of Bangkok, Wat Plang Vipassana, and it was a traditional city monastery. They had study monks there. But they had a meditation section. There was probably about, I'm thinking back, maybe about 8 kutis in a section of the monastery. And there was encouragement for monks and lay people, laymen in particular in that section, to be practicing. And there's a whole other section for the lay women and nuns. But they had one of the reasons why I went is because I'd heard that it was a practice monastery with a good selection of English books in their library. So then because I had just finished doing a month-long Mahasi Sayadaw retreat. That was my introduction to meditation in my life. And I wanted to continue meditating. And I had to come to Bangkok to extend my passport. So I was there, and then I got to this place. I'm really wanting to learn more about Buddhism and get more practice under my belt. And then I came across there's about 2 or 3 or 4 anecdotes of somebody who had been at Wat Pah Pong and had written down some teachings that Ajahn Chah gave. And they really impressed me. Something spoke to me. And so then I ended up ordaining, in my mind, a temporary ordination. I'm 24 years old. I'm on the road. I've been traveling for about a year by then, and still keen on traveling. But I thought, the monks at that monastery had said you could take it. It was ordinary to take temporary ordination, 3 months, 4 months. And I thought, 3 or 4 months, I can do that. And so then I took ordination, and then I started hearing about, because of the English library there, and also the abbot the vice abbot spoke good English, so that there was various lay people and monks coming to there. So then started hearing about these forest monasteries, and that started sounding really attractive. And then started hearing Ajahn Chah again. And so I was fairly newly ordained, probably maybe a month ordained. And I spoke with the abbot of the monastery, and he encouraged me to go and pay respects to Ajahn Chah. That would be he's a really good teacher. And Ajahn Chah wasn't that well known, really, at that time, but the abbot was familiar with Ajahn Chah and really encouraged me to go. So I went up to Ubon. You take an overnight train, and then I can't remember how I got from the train station to Wat Pah Pong, and then walk into Wat Pah Pong, and it's just, this forest, and really peaceful. It's incredibly cool and beautiful. And monks coming back from alms around, and sort of seeing all this, and it's a nice, clean monastery, and it was really orderly. And then go to pay respects to Luang Por. I get taken to pay respects to Luang Por. I bow 3 times, and then Ajahn Chah was just really quiet. And then he looked at me. If you want to stay here, you have to stay at least 5 years. So that was the first thing that Ajahn Chah said to me. I was terrified. The idea of 5 years was just like, it's almost the rest of your life at that age. So it put me in turmoil. And so I ended up staying a few weeks, but the idea of 5 years just was too intimidating. And so then I left and went to another monastery, a meditation center in central Thailand. And I spent many months there, and practicing quite diligently. And after several months, sort of like, I just kept thinking of Ajahn Chah all the time. And so I thought, I've got to go back and give myself 5 years is 5 years. I got to do it. So I went back. It was after I wrote, and when I'd first gone to Wat Pah Pong, Ajahn Sumedho wasn't there. He was still off on Tudong in India. But then I wrote to Wat Pah Pong, and then Ajahn Sumedho actually answered. It was before the Pansa, asking to go and spend the Pansa spend the Vasa at Wat Pah Pong. That would have been 1974. And Ajahn Sumedho wrote back and welcomed me to come and spend the Vasa. And then I spoke with my teacher at the place that I was at, and this was like he'd been building, he hadn't been there all the time, and so he said, I haven't been here to really guide you or give instruction, and I've been building it, but I've had duties at the main monastery. He'd lived there for many years, and this was his own monastery. He was finally setting up his own place, and asked him, please spend the Vasa with us, and I'll take you myself. I've got an invitation after the rains retreat to teach nearby Wat Pah Pong, and I'll take you up there myself. So I said, okay. So I ended up being taken up by my teacher and given to Ajahn Chah. So Ajahn Chah, the impression I had was, he was obviously a certain fierceness there that was intimidating, but then also the kind of just something about him and about the place. And to a certain degree, I mean, it was the place itself was a reflection of Ajahn Chah, in the sense that here was a monastery that people were committed to practice and training, and had a real focus for giving themselves to the practice. And one of the things that, was inspired by the monastic community, but it was also really inspired by the lay community. The lay community because every week, there was people there every day coming to help support the place, and there was always people sort of around. But then on the lunar observance day, the hall would be full of people who were meditating and listening to Dhamma. And that, in those days, I mean, I could hardly sit cross-legged on the floor. And knees up to my ears, incredibly uncomfortable. And sitting on a concrete floor, I had a hard time sitting for very long. And these lay people were sitting meditation for hours. And it was really inspiring. So just seeing that commitment and the effect that it had on a lay society around, and the villages and the town, that was really inspiring. Well, the effect that Ajahn Chah had on so many people. And then one of the last things that I experienced at Wat Pah Pong in that first visit was Magha Puja. So that was a formal festival day, and again, many, many people coming. But that used to be the time when all the various branch monasteries of Wat Pah Pong would come together. And at that time, let's say 1974, there's probably, 12 to 15 branch monasteries. And so then, you end up with a large number of monks gathering, a huge number of lay people, and the simple ceremony of a circumambulation, and then the Dhamma teachings that are given. It was just something really inspiring to that, and the sense of, yes, Ajahn Chah was a great meditator and a very independent, solitary person, but he's somebody who had a huge effect on the world around him. And so that was really, to me, very, very inspiring.